My name is Linda Mora, and I'm the editor of Moving Archives, published this year by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. The book will be launched digitally on August 6, 2020, at which time the launch will be moderated by Dr. Kate Eckhorn in conversation with contributors to the book. The book was conceived in May of 2015, initially presented as a panel of papers of the Congress of the Social Sciences and Humanities. The initial call for papers, and in the book itself, invite consideration of the relationship between archives and affect, between the public and the personal, between place and displacement. There are 9 contributors to Moving Archives who consider questions like, what does an archive mean for the self, the community, the nation? What are our personal and collective investments in archives? For whom do these archives speak? What happens when we move archives or are moved by them? These are what some of the contributors have had to say about their chapters that appear in the book.
The chapter that I've written with Patricia Gorbu is about the movement of documents from a living author's home to the institutional archives at the University of Sherbrooke. It's about the movement of those documents and our personal experience of engaging with the author as he sees his life work shift from his home to the archive.
Je suis aussi très heureuse de la collaboration avec Marc-André Fortin, qui a été permise dans le cadre de ce travail. Le point de départ, la naissance de l'archive de D.G. Jones, a été, je pense, un moment marquant au moment où ça s'est produit pour nous, pour Marc-André et moi. Et l'occasion de faire retour là-dessus, d'écrire là-dessus, d'inclure une dimension réflexive, créatrice aussi. Ça a été une expérience très riche, très stimulante.
So this article grew out of time that I spent at Library and Archives Canada early in my dissertation project. I was looking for texts that were about childhood in settler colonial Canada and found materials related to the Sunday school movement. So the Canada Sunday School Union's annual reports, the primary archival source of my chapter in Moving Archives, demonstrated a preoccupation not just with the texts that were distributed to the Sunday schools, but with how these libraries were circulated and how they impacted and shaped the family farms that resided behind the child reader. So this archive is ultimately all about movement and tracking the movement and the efficacy of these texts.
My name's Catherine McLeod, and in this chapter, I listen to the moving archives of Canadian poet Phyllis Webb. In 1955, Webb published a report, The Poet and the Publisher. She published that report in a journal, delivered it at a conference, published it again in the conference proceedings, and then broadcast it on CBC Radio. In this chapter, I focus on that one report, but my work on Webb is part of a book that I'm writing with Wilfrid Laurier University Press. And early on in that research, I pitched this idea for this chapter to Linda Mora. The idea started with one recording of Webb's voice, a recording that was moving. I invite you to listen for that recording in this chapter and to stay tuned for more.
In this chapter, I argue that archives are the double hook of Black Canadian criticism. The experience of recovering Black Canada's archival record is aptly described, I say, by the central image of Sheila Watson's The Double Hook. As she writes, "When you fish for glory, you catch the darkness too. If you hook twice the glory, you hook twice the fear." On the one hand, archives are a key site for helping us find and claim Black histories, texts, and contexts that have been repressed and erased. On the other hand, working with archives hooks much fear. To read an archive, Sadiya Hartman writes, is to enter a mortuary. How does one recuperate lives entangled with and impossible to differentiate from the terrible utterances that condemn them to death, the account books that identified them as units of value, the invoices that claimed them as property, and the banal chronicles that strip them of human features. In my chapter, I turn to Manitoba author Troy Burl Bailey's long poem to conceptualize a radically detextualized archive. I conceptualize the rushing waterways of Western Turtle Island as a liquid archive in order to pry history open to creative poetic reinterpretation and to enable Black actors to slip the bibliographic control of the European archive.
My contribution to Moving Archives considers how archives can be emotionally moving and how archival research can be moved by our own emotions as researchers. It tells a research story recounting how my own experiences of bereavement caused me to reconsider research I'd earlier conducted in the archives of Lucy Maud Montgomery and Sylvia Plath. My experiences as a grieving mother and of record keeping as part of that grief made me notice the kinds of grief work being undertaken by Montgomery in her journals and by Plath's mother Aurelia in the compilation of her daughter's archives. Looking at these records through a grief work lens changed the way I interpreted them. It caused me to see different things than I'd previously seen and to ask different questions about how I, as a researcher and my discipline of archival studies, could, as Catherine Hobbs puts it, do right by archives and their creators. Ultimately, this chapter is about how my own experience of bereavement moved not only me, but also my work in ways I could never have imagined and that I cannot help but acknowledge now.
Hello, it's Susan Rudy speaking to you from Norwich in England. My chapter from Moving Archives is called Reading for Queer Openings, and it examines the effective dimensions of archives, but also the autobiographical self as a source of the archive. In it, I begin by reflecting on my work on the creation of the digital archive of the former poet laureate Fred Waugh back in the first decade of the 21st century. But in reflecting on that work and on Fred Waugh's work and on which work of Fred Waugh's that I had been drawn to and why, I soon realized that I had accessed what Fred Waugh calls archives of the self through reading his work and working on the archive. My chapter was moving for me to write in the sense that it links my coming out story to the text I was reading, but it is also intended to move others. Through my work with Fred Waugh on his archive, I was opened up to the archives of feeling and liminal spaces that I needed in order to get through a difficult period in my own life.